Welcome to What Dogs Have Taught Me. I'm your host, Julie Hart, and this is the podcast where we stop to wonder if we are truly grasping the lessons our canine companions could teach us. This episode is a deep dive into the science behind your dog's behavior, one that can genuinely change how you understand your dog. In this conversation, my guest Kristen Clarkson and I explore how the nervous system drives decision-making in dogs, why all living things are motivated to maintain homeostasis, and what that really means for behavior. We unpack how dogs experience the world internally, how their emotional processing differs from ours, and what we can do to help regulate and support their nervous systems. We also get into big, often misunderstood topics like internal sensory input, the role of arousal and emotional valence, and how much we truly understand behavioral medications in dogs. Kristen Clarkson holds a PhD in immunology and currently works as a neuroimmunologist in therapeutic drug development for neurological autoimmune diseases, one of them being multiple sclerosis. She specializes in how the immune system and nervous system interact with each other and how therapeutic drugs impact each of these systems in different disease settings. Although not her primary area of research, Kristen also has a special interest in affective neuroscience and understanding how the nervous system interprets both external and internal sensory inputs, leading to subsequent action and behavior. As if that weren't enough, Kristen has spent over 20 years competing in agility with her Kelpies at a national level and has taught agility for many years, giving her practical, hands-on understanding. I first met Kristen in October 2023 at a workshop I was teaching with Phyllis Smuland, who's joining us in this podcast, in Virginia. Kristen later joined me again in May 2024 for the Fearful Feral Dog Workshop in New Mexico. For this episode, Kristen also created visual slides to support our discussion. You can view them on my YouTube channel under What Dogs Have Taught Me and go to the podcast playlist. Look for the Nervous System in a Dog Suit podcast. One of the most powerful visuals explores the relationship between homeostasis, arousal, and valence, a concept that may completely reshape how you think about dog behavior and your own. As always, please follow and subscribe this podcast if you value the content. It really means a lot, and that way you won't miss new episodes when they come out. So welcome, Kristen Clarkson, to the What Dogs Have Taught Me podcast. You sent me a bio that says you have a PhD in immunology and you work as an immunologist for neurological autoimmune diseases. But explain a little bit what that is, first of all, and then we'll go into how we're going to apply that to dogs.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm trained as an immunologist. So an immunologist is anybody that, works to understand the immune system. So the immune system is like vaccine responses, infection responses, anything like that. But the immune system is very broad and has a lot of roles beyond just sort of pathogenic responses. So that's what my PhD is in mostly infectious disease immunology, but I work in neurological diseases. So what does that mean? That means any disease that involves an incorrect immune response against our own body, particularly against the nervous system. So that's like the intersection of where I work. So I'm not a neuroscientist, but I have to have a deep understanding of the nervous system in order to understand the types of diseases that I work in, like multiple sclerosis or ALS. I'm trying to think of more common ones that people know. Lupus. Those sorts of things. Lupus. It's more rheumatic, less neurological, but yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And when we were talking about doing this podcast, you were saying you understand how drugs affect the correct me, my terminology if I'm wrong, nervous system, the body, and also like about rewards and punishment and how those will affect the nervous system.
Mostly. And so I was hoping if it would be okay, if I could take like maybe 5-10 minutes to go through some sort of very high level concepts, because I think a lot of your questions that you sent me are going to have some kind of basis in what I'm going to show. So
okay,
if you're cool with that, I'll share my screen.
Before that, let me
have
you talk about your experience with dogs in the past as well.
Oh, yeah.
No, like, I mean, we met through dogs. We didn't meet through
Yeah. Yes.
So talk a little bit about your interest in dogs and what you've done with dogs and how these two things kind of, converged. And then we'll go to the slides because I want to see what they are.
Yeah. I always say this. I was born loving dogs. I think as a kid, I felt more comfortable around dogs than people most of the time. And I don't know what it was. I just was a young kid and would immediately gravitate towards dogs. And it took me 10 years to convince my parents to finally get me my own dog. And then they finally did. My first dog was a bi-black Sheltie, and it was the best day of my life. And I brought that dog home, and I wanted to do everything with it, like literally everything. And I got into obedience because I feel like that's kind of the first thing that you get told, oh, go to an obedience class. And I liked it, but it was, I wanted something more active. And so I saw agility on TV and I was like, oh yeah, that's for me. And so I started doing with agility, and, I just got really lucky. My first dog was dynamite. I mean, like killed it, like won regional championships and was invited on the world team. And like I just got lucky, like a random breeder. But anyways, that sort of launched my very long agility career. I did agility for about 20 years. I both taught, well, maybe 15, I don't know, 15 to 20. I taught and I competed heavily. And then I just progressed from Shelties to Kelpies. And then I got into rescue, and I rescued my first dog after my male Kelpie passed away. And he had a lot of behavioral issues, but it is still fascinating to me to this day how separated the agility world is from the behavior world, and how shockingly little I knew about canine behavior, even though I've been training agility for 20 years and I teach it, right? Like it wasn't just a little pastime. It was like my everything for a while. And he had major behavioral issues, and that's actually led to, he eventually had to be put down, and it led to me getting another dog, who is actually how I met you and Phyllis, because he also had behavioral issues, came from a rescue. Yeah, I met Angela through someone. Angela Luke was the one who then told me to go to your guys' workshop that you were holding at her place. Mm-hmm. Big dog that you guys probably remember. Mm-hmm. And then, yeah, I think just that was sort of the pinnacle of me, like having this deep need to understand, how have I been training dogs for 20 years and I know so little about their actual behavior. And so, I clung on to Phyllis and you, and I've taken a couple of classes from CHRI. So, yeah.
Yeah, you came out to New Mexico and
I did.
Yeah. You did really good with the dogs you were working with. So
I mean, it's been amazing because I get to see this totally different perspective. And plus I get to bring in the things that I know about how the nervous system works into my understanding. But a lot of the understanding that I need is coming from you guys who have that experience with dogs and dog behavior.
If it makes you feel any better, I wouldn't know how to train agility.
I'm sure you would.
I could figure it out. I've taken a few courses with one dog that I had, and she did great, but it's still
something that I certainly don't specialize in. So
Yeah, that's fair. Everything's a specialty at some point, I guess.
yeah. Yeah. So all right. So back
Okay.
to the slides.
Okay. I'm going to kind of walk you through some high level concepts. Pause me if you have questions, but there's a lot of things that I think are incorrectly understood in the context of neuroscience and therefore in the context of behavior. And that's what I kind of want to try to get across a little bit today. So what I have on the left here is, obviously just a brain. And then, we're ultimately talking about behavior, right? So how do we get from A to behavior? And this safety goal will come up multiple times as we talk, I think. But the way that the brain works, and when I talk about this, I want it to be very clear that this is how it works across all animal species. Our nervous system we have the same genes as like fish and jellyfish and insects. And so we like to think we're very special and different. And we do have unique capabilities. But every single species is perfectly adapted for their environment. We're not special, we're just different. So what all goes into how we decide on a behavior? It's mostly these three things. It's certainly, there's lots of things that can affect it, but it's your current situation, your past experiences, and affect. And I'll explain a little bit more about what affect is. But the way that brains figure out how to do the behavior is through a process called prediction. And I think this is a big misnomer in the understanding of like cognitive thought. We create concepts. So a concept can be the color green. That's a concept, right? That's the concept of a color. That's a concept. We can create concepts of climbing a tree, right? And then we can take that concept of climbing a tree to get away from a predator and expand that to other things that we can climb. So like kind of a purely mental concept. You can climb stairs for a different purpose, not necessarily to get away from a predator or something like that. So this is how our brain works all the time. And you can see this in an example of like, if you're walking in the forest and you see something rustle, you maybe think it's a snake. And you automatically jump back because you want to avoid like stepping in the path of a potentially poisonous snake. If your brain didn't work through predictive processing, you wouldn't have that ability to step back. All of that processing, your brain's gone through this whole process of, I see leaves, what could that be? It's probably a snake. That snake might pose a threat to me. I'm going to jump back. All of that happens outside of your awareness. It's a reflex for you to jump back to preserve your safety. And so that idea that the brain is always working through prediction, a lot of that, which is out of your cognitive awareness, is essential to understand behavior because it really impacts what you're going to do next. Are you going to jump back? Well, maybe I really like snakes. Maybe I want to go look at it. Like I actually do like snakes. I had a pet snake growing up.
Oh, no.
Everything is context dependent. And that's why history is so important. You cannot understand behavior without also understanding someone's past experiences or historical experiences. And that's often overlooked too. We try to always come up with this perfect formula of A plus B equals X, right? And you can't because everything's individualized. And so your brain uses your past experiences to come up with potential explanations for your current experience. Mm-hmm. And so that's also where we get a little bit out of sync in the understanding of what is the brain using to come up with how I feel? Because ultimately your brain asks, what did I do the last time I was in this situation when I felt this way? And that when I felt this way often gets left out of the picture. To complicate things even more, we tend to think about our sensory information as like just classical 5 senses: sight, hearing, taste, smell, those things. But there's a whole myriad of other sensory input that we get from our body. And really, all of these things interact in an individual manner to create affect. Now, I realize that was a lot, so I'm going to keep going. Pause me if you have questions, but I'm going to break down kind of these individual components.
Okay.
Let's start with affect. Affect is a combination of what we call valence and arousal. So arousal is just your overall excitement level. How low energy versus high energy are you feeling at this time? That's all that arousal is. Valence is how overall pleasant or unpleasant something feels. And so you can kind of think about all of this on this like dimensional plane of at any point in time, you will be here, right? Being in this high arousal, low valence box over here, which you might associate with like emotion words like anger or fear or something like that. This is still a spectrum. And so it's important to understand that just because you're in this box doesn't mean that you are binarily feeling high arousal, low valence. There's still somewhere along this point, you can have medium high arousal, you know? So it's important to understand that it's very fluid. And our ultimate goal is always to get back to homeostasis. And homeostasis, you can use this also as a feeling of safety, if that's like an easier thing. But essentially, it's like the equalness of your body at any given moment to feel relaxed in its own state. It also has to mean that your body is perfectly balanced in terms of like your metabolic needs, those sorts of things. And we are constantly flowing in and out of homeostasis. And that is perfectly fine. That's very normal. If you get stuck in traffic, you're probably going to be in a low valence, like this sucks. And depending on how urgently you need to get somewhere, maybe your arousal is low because you're not in a rush, but maybe your arousal is high because you are in a rush. But we recover very quickly from those and we quickly return to homeostasis. And so this entire sort of picture is really what affect means. But that still doesn't tell us how we get to affect. And that's where the nervous system really comes in. And so a lot of this you can ignore because some of this I just pulled from some slides at work. But if you focus on this central person here, the nervous system consists of two parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system is considered to be the brain and the spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system is everything that comes out and comes back in to the brain. And that's an important piece of information because we often think of, sending signals down to your muscles, right, to create hand motion or leg motion or anything like that. But we forget about the fact that our body is also sending signals through the nervous system back to us that has to go all the way into our spinal cord, travel all the way up to brain for us to make actual sense of the information. Now, our body can make decisions without coming up to this cognitive portion of our brain. That's a reflex. So if the tapping of the knee at a doctor, if you whack that, that is your body having a reflex that is bypassing your your brain's ability to cognitively be aware of that. And it's doing that knee motion outside of your cognitive awareness. And that's why you can't control it, is because it's a reflex. I'll pause there and see if there's if this is way too overwhelming or if it's okay so far.
No, I'm following.
Okay, great. So
I'm constantly thinking about how to apply this to fearful dogs during your entire talk, but that's I'm hoping that it'll be interesting for the context of fearfulness, but so we've talked about the central nervous system, which is brain and spinal cord. And we've talked about the peripheral nervous system. Now, you can certainly talk more about the brain and the spinal cord. I don't think that we need to for our talk today. I will point out this very interesting part in our brain, which is right here, and it's called the somatosensory cortex. So when I was talking about signals that go down to your body, you can see right here on this lower left part, the red is your motor cortex. So this is where a signal comes up to your brain and it says, you need to move your tongue. And so that signal is going to travel all the way up to right here and then tell that tongue to move. And that gives us the ability to talk. This is the sensory, sorry, I said motor coming in. This is the motor. Motor is going out, sensory is coming in. So sorry, I had that backwards. I was saying that backwards. But the sensory information that's coming into your body will come here. And I think what's so interesting is this is directly proportional to how much of our neurons are dedicated to the different parts of our body. So look how much of our brain part is dedicated to facial muscles. Whereas like the trunk, well, geez, your entire trunk just gets that much of your brain. I mean, that's a tiny amount, right? And it's different across your sensory inputs versus your motor outputs. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So I think that's what I wanted to say about the central nervous system, but the peripheral nervous system is particularly interesting. And this is really where we're going to spend a lot of our time. So if you look at just the breakdown of the peripheral nervous system, there are multiple different arms, and there's a lot of different ways that people classify the peripheral nervous system because we're still learning about it. And so I think the way that it's shown here is the newer way to classify it. It used to be these are all my junk slides, but it used to be classified in this way. Peripheral was somatic versus autonomic, and then parasympathetic and sympathetic, which again, we'll talk about. But it doesn't make sense to classify it that way when you understand that each one of those buckets both have sensory and motor neurons, because those always have to be in connection with the brain and spinal cord. So they break it up now by sensory versus motor neurons. And yeah.
So in there, because a big thing now, well, at least what I see happening with dogs, there's a lot of talk about parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. So then how do those fit into this new organization?
It's a great question. And I'm going to go into that in just a second. But for that, so within the peripheral nervous system, so all of these blue lines, they all come back, like I said, to the central nervous system. And that's what's shown here. So you may have heard of cranial versus spinal nerves. These nerves that are coming out of your brain are considered the cranial nerves. And so you can see you've got your olfactory nerve, which is responsible for your sense of smell. Now, some of your cranial nerves have either sensory or motor function. So they either interpret sensory information coming in, or they send motor information going out, or they can do both. And I'm going to talk more about that with the vagus nerve because that one's super interesting. But, I think it's so interesting. When you go to the doctor and they do these like ocular, like follow your finger up, down, left, right. They're actually testing multiple nerve functions in just that one test, because ocular function is spread across the trochlear nerve, the oculomotor nerve, and one other, I can't recall, but each one has different motions. So the abducens nerve does left eye movement. The ocular motor does the majority of other movement, as well as the pupil reflex. So it's not a one-to-one, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Just because you have a oculomotor nerve does not mean that that's the only nerve that contributes to all your eye motion. So Same thing for all your spinal nerves. And I love this concept. This is just a figure of what's called dermatomes. But every single spinal nerve, so across your spine, in between your vertebrae, you have a pair of nerves that extends out. And you have a section for your cervical spine, your thoracic spine, your lumbar spine, your sacral area, and there's also a coccygeal nerve. But every single one of those nerves are responsible for different functions and areas of the body. And so that's why, if you have tingling in your hands and in your fingers, sometimes the neurologist will ask you which fingers, because it makes a difference, right? C8, nerve C8 is the pinky and ring finger, but nerve C7 is the middle finger, but it's actually different on the front versus the back. So it's really important there's just like, try to think of the nervous system less as like such a concrete, black and white thing, and more of like a fluid redundancy measure for us. Okay. And so that's a high level overview of like the cranial and spinal nerves. And so what you are getting to is how does this impact sort of that sympathetic versus parasympathetic, those two divisions, but they get so much like hype, right? Like everybody talks about the autonomic nervous system and the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions, but it's actually pretty interesting. So of all the spinal nerves, so you can see these are just like listed here, the parasympathetic nerves are a group of nerves separate from the sympathetic nerves, and they drive complementary responses. Another thing that this is like your fight or flight, okay? So parasympathetic is your rest and digest system. Your sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight system. And so you can see the contrast, right? Your parasympathetic, when it is being activated, your pupils constrict, your airways constrict, your heart rate slows, your stomach activity slows down, because again, your peripheral nervous system controls your gut motility, your organ function, all of those things. Whereas in sympathetic activity, your pupils are dilated, you have increased blood pressure, your body's essentially preparing itself to fight or flight or whatever it needs to do. And so I think one of your questions was like, there's so much hype about calming the autonomic nervous system right now. Is that even really a thing? And the answer is yes, 100%. You can practice calming your nervous system by activating the nerves associated with the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, it's not always that easy, but
what I'm getting is I didn't quite think of it this way, but when you go into fight or flight mode, let's say,
yeah,
body activates nerves that go to all these different areas of your body that control, like you were saying, eyes, heart rate. So there's tons of nerves that go to all those parts. And then there's tons of nerves that would, at the same time, would they shut off the parasympathetic or just take over?
Think of them sort of as like a coexisting system that complements each other, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that one's on and one's off. It's fluid. One can come on, come off. They can both be kind of on. One can totally take over. So it's different nerves associated with that. And I forgot to mention, the vagus nerve is a key nerve in the parasympathetic nervous system. It is also, I'm going to jump back to this, of all your cranial nerves, it is the only nerve that extends beyond the brain. So your vagus nerve comes down, and your vagus nerve regulates your enteric nervous system. It regulates your parasympathetic nervous system. So that whole concept of like vagus nerve activation is a very real concept. If you can
like there's vasovagal exercises you can do, like breathing exercises, those sorts of things that, I mean, you could do them right now and you would be able to feel the impact on your own nervous system.
Well,
that is definitely something that is real.
It's interesting, because I did yoga for, I don't know, 15 years. And then during COVID, that kind of all went to crap. And then I kind of slacked off. And now I do karate.
Yeah. Oh, nice.
Doing yoga, I mean, I definitely learned through just practicing in class how to, calm down. At least that's what I thought was happening, my parasympathetic nervous system, right? Because like all those things would probably start happening. It'd be cool to kind of, put a little, I don't know, sensor on each part and see. But
I mean, they've already had studies. I mean, there are multiple studies showing the actual like biochemical benefits of yoga, because you do have to constantly practice activating your parasympathetic system, which, is going to turn off your sympathetic system from being overactive. And when you have that sort of chronic sympathetic activation, you're constantly in a state of like stress or fear or those sorts of ideas, in order to be reactive to your environment. Whereas in your parasympathetic nervous system, you're calm, you're relaxed, you feel safe, you're comfortable in your environment.
Yeah, and I listen to a lot of podcasts because if I'm driving, that's kind of what I do for entertainment. And they were saying that, and of course I knew this, but the way they put it kind of made sense, is that you can't wait until you need to calm it down.
Exactly.
Learn how to do it.
Yes.
Practice doing it ahead of time.
Yes.
Of course, makes sense because we practice everything else that we need. You don't go and do a piano recital without learning how to play the piano and practice. So
exactly.
I thought that was.
And it also makes sense in the context of how the brain works. If we go back to if we always bring it back to prediction, that's the same, because you can hone your predictions. That's the same thing as when you first start playing piano, you suck, right? But you practice and you get muscle memory. That is your brain honing your prediction for your finger motor functions, right? It hones your predictions as to how it needs to stretch or do something. It's the same thing as practicing yoga. You're constantly honing your predictions to focus on the parasympathetic function rather than the sympathetic function.
All right, cool. Got it so far.
Okay. Those were the majority of the slides, but I think something else that I wanted to point out is that nervous systems are also not in a vacuum. We can feel other people's nervous systems. When Phyllis says she can feel a dog, she can.
Yeah.
She literally can. So that's also why dogs, not traditionally, I understand that, but I think now dogs have become such a part of our culture in like an almost obsessive way, right? Because dogs can help, we can co-regulate. Being a social species, and this applies to any social species, they have the ability to co-regulate either within their species or across. And so, pets very much do help us regulate our nervous system, and we help regulate theirs. Mm-hmm. And so it is a two-way street. But it is also very important to understand that your negative nervous system, so if you are constantly in sympathetic state, that will affect your dog. Your dog will feel that.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you guys know this all the time, but it's also really hard, I think, for people that don't necessarily have an understanding of these ideas to understand that their nervous system might actually be the problem, right? Because it takes a lot of self-reflection to realize that maybe I am feeling a little bit stressed or anxious or whatever it is that we want to say. It takes a lot of introspective analysis, if you will.
And I think the homeostasis you were talking about, I mean, my clients are a lot more relaxed than the Virginia clients here, just because of where we live and kind of the culture. I mean, in Virginia, people are high strung.
Yep.
And I think if you're always that way, you don't even know anymore what homeostasis feels
100%.
like. And so it's hard for people. Like, I had a client last night and they actually had done a great job with their dog. And he's not easy, but the lady's still a little nervous about walking him. And, from walking behind her, I can see her hand like clenched on that leash and like her arms all tense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I pointed it out. She's like, I didn't even realize.
Yeah.
I
mean, you really don't. Because again, that's prediction, right? Your brain has gotten so good at predicting that you'll be in a sympathetic state it's outside of your awareness now. You don't even realize that you're chronically in that state.
Yeah.
But being chronically in that state has a tremendous amount of health implications. Have you ever heard of the ACEs study?
Maybe.
So it's a great study that the CDC put out a long time ago, but it's called the Adverse Childhood Event
yes.
study. Yeah.
I've heard.
And it shows that people that have had, more or significant childhood traumatic events have a higher risk of developing chronic illness later in life. But it's unfortunate that is a very underappreciated idea. Yeah.
I mean, it makes complete sense. If you have those experiences, which is unfortunate, and I forget there's a huge percentage of people that.
So development changes, like your final brain isn't developed till I think like in 20s. So It depends. But I think that study was mostly focused on the chronicity of like young, so like under 15 events, but also not just were you assaulted, were you that, but did your parents, get a divorce? Like just even little things, and people don't appreciate that even little things that constantly happen. Were you teased? Were you bullied? Those sorts of things, they dramatically impact your nervous system. If you can't or don't know how to regulate your own nervous system through whatever way, it doesn't have to be through like vagal exercises, but if you can't undo that sort of chronic activation, then that is what can lead to chronic health conditions later on. I think one of the things that I think is so important is that traditionally medicine has tried to make a very strict divide between psychiatric disorders and health conditions. I'm going to show this because I think it's very compelling, but maybe it's not. This is your nervous system in development. So when you have a fetus, this is what the central nervous system looks like. Okay, so it just goes through like this development process, and I think this is like a 5-week embryo. Okay, but essentially the end of the message is this is what you start with, this is what you end with. Mm-hmm. You can't break up health and mental health because it's all the same organ, right? It is understanding your interoceptive sensory input that will help you understand your emotions. But emotions themselves are a concept. They're a word that we use to try to describe how we're feeling in a moment. But it's important to understand that emotions are a human concept.
I would think that if, let's say, you have a nice, happy, stable childhood until you're like 8,
mm-hmm.
and then something bad happens, you have the foundation that you developed already to fall back on, versus if you're just born into chaos and you can never develop anything stable.
Yes. Yeah. And like your environment, even when you're a very young baby. So humans, we actually birth our young quite young. We birth our children quite young because human heads are so large. We have to birth them quite early or they won't be able to fit out of our vaginas. So we birth our young slightly underdeveloped. And so human babies are unable to regulate their nervous system without their parent. And they have to have a parent or someone taking care of them to feed them, to nurture them, to calm them, to soothe them, to all those things in order for their nervous system to learn how to be fully developed. And they can't do that on their own. So, for example, if you're an orphan and you never got that sort of like touch is a very important thing for primates. That's why we're always touching our dogs, right? We're primates. Like we just like to touch things. That's what we do. If you don't ever get that touch as a very young infant, it can really impact your like ability to understand sensory input later in life.
Mm. So this is interesting. This is completely off topic, but it sprung to mind. So, my karate sensei, who's quite a personality, he was telling us in class that when his kids were little and they would get upset, that he would sit them on his lap and breathe with them.
That's smart.
And I was like, oh my gosh, I never thought of that.
That's
right?
really
And,
smart.
Teach them how to, he didn't like yell at them for being upset or anything like that. He just would teach them how to calm themselves down. And I'm like, wow, that's freaking brilliant.
And they will, that child will now have that concept for the rest of their lives, right?
Yeah.
But unless, like the whole let them cry it out methodology is like a really debunked methodology in science now, because if you let your infant cry it out, they're crying because they can't regulate their own nervous system. So something is wrong. They're hungry, they're thirsty, they're tired, something feels wrong. Maybe they just have a tummy ache or something.
Like, I did irreparable harm one time to my son because I'm like, you just.
Well, luckily we're it's the repeated it's the repeated exposures to that kind of environment. Like we're, all new parents, we all mess up. So, you can't do everything perfectly, but you can correct your wrongs later on and do better next time.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Good to know. He hasn't started therapy yet. So yeah, I honestly wish I would have worked with dogs maybe before I would have had kids, because I would have had more skills.
Yeah.
Like, just to kind of remain calm and no, I didn't know all this stuff when I was a parent, right? Because of dogs.
Yeah, exactly.
But all right, cool. So we have our basis of all of our questions. Yeah. Phyllis, do you have any questions?
No.
You just hanging out listening?
I'm hanging out listening.
All right.
Fascinating.
Gosh, it must be interesting being you and watching all of, I'm like, oh wow, now what did Kristen think of my whole concept?
I mean, I why do you think I cling to you guys? Seriously, I love this, because the problem with, I hate to say problem, but it's an unavoidable thing, because you can't do it any other way until you think about it differently. We will always view dog behavior through a human lens, and it's just wrong. It's just incorrect. We are totally different species. We're not even in the same realm as them, right? We're primates and they're canine. We're just so different. Yes, we have the same nervous system, so these concepts still apply, but there are differences across nervous systems, right? So, one of the big differences being, if you notice, in order to use categorization, so in order for us to figure out what to do, we need concepts. And so those can be generated, they can be purely motor concepts, like moving my arm up and down, or they can be totally mental concepts, like the concept of money and wealth. That is a purely, there's nothing real about a $1 bill, aside from the fact that humans as a collective have decided that that is our currency, right? So that is one difference between dogs and humans, is that humans have the ability to create purely mental concepts that have no apparent relation to each other. in order to create social reality, right? So this concept of always moving towards safety, we still do that. But then I always hear back from people like, oh, well, we're not foraging and hunting anymore. And we're not, we live in houses and we're safe, generally speaking. It's not just about that, right? So safety, and then you could also argue the other side. Well, there's a lot of people that are unhoused and, all of that, but I'm talking about somebody who's housed, but the goal is still safety, right? So safety to me now means, do I keep my job? Do I pay my bills on time? Safety is different depending on context. And that is really important to understand, because what is safe to me may not feel safe to someone else, and vice versa. And it's the same thing for a dog. What may feel safe to one dog may not for another dog.
Yeah. And I think as we go up, I mean, there's a lot of homeless people in Albuquerque, right? And of course, I always think they must choose where they camp because of safety. There must be some advantage to it. And so they're at a much different survival level than most of us are. And, it starts to become like, I don't know, Northern Virginia, perfect example, right? It starts to become safety and getting into the right college.
Mm-hmm.
So to get into the right college, your kid has to play soccer and play the violin, right?
Exactly.
All these, that's our concept of safety. And then the whole social media thing, of course, so it's much at a different level than dogs. They can't even comprehend.
It is and it isn't. Yes, it's at a very different level. If we go back to the homeless and the housed, yes, they have totally different concerns, but the neural pathway of feeling safe is still the same. The feeling of unsafety doesn't differ depending on the reason.
Mm-hmm.
It's still a feeling of unsafe. So a great example I love to use. So I have EDS, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a connective tissue disorder. And essentially my ligaments hold bone to bone. They are too loose. And so I have hypermobile joints. But in all of your joints, you have what are called proprioceptors. And they are little receptors on the edge of your tissue that give you it's right here, the ability to sense your position and movement of our body parts. And so it allows you to know where your body is in space and time. So the fact that I know that my cup is to the right of me, about a foot in front of me, that is my proprioceptive sensory inputs telling me that my cup is there. But because I have EDS and my joints are more mobile than they should be, my proprioceptive inputs are constantly screaming at me, you're unsafe, you're going to fall, you're going to trip, you're going to dislocate something, because my joints are constantly dislocating because they don't hold them in place. So it's that kind of like, it's the chronicity of that sort of message that I get bombarded with. You're unsafe, you're unsafe. And it's such a simplistic thing, right? I'm a little bit wobbly, like not a big deal, but it does take a big toll on your, overall health, just because it's exhausting to have that constant, like, buzzing, like you're unsafe, you're unsafe, you're unsafe.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, I would imagine so. It would be exhausting.
Again, I really like to try and make the connection between psychiatric wellness and medical wellness. And I personally feel that those two should not, they're intertwined, and I just don't feel like you can separate them out. And so I love using EDS as an example of safety, because it's a clearly medical disorder, but a lot of it is about sort of your interoceptive sensory inputs and how you interpret those.
So let's say, okay, the dog I saw last night has had an FHO, which is where they remove the hip joint, because it was, I don't know if he had dysplasia or what, but he walks very, let's just say, wobbly.
Does he still have the leg?
Still has all of his legs, and he's supposedly not in pain, and they give him pain meds occasionally if needed. But can a dog, so I'm going back to your syndrome,
mm-hmm.
Can a dog know that they're compromised like that and feel less safe?
they may not have the cognitive awareness that my joints feel wobbly and therefore I feel unsafe. But again, that signal of safety, absolutely. If dogs have proprioceptive receptors, which I know they do because they are very aware of their bodies, and they communicate through body language all the time, so they must, then absolutely. If they have a chronically unstable area, they will constantly get that signal of like, you're unsafe, you're unsafe. And so that's why physical health is so important in behavior. We can't get around it. You have to have a physical, healthy body in order for you to have a healthy mind, if you will.
So let's flip it around and say, okay, so I had a dog, 2 hip replacements and a TPLO, right? Like she was a structural nightmare. And then I have Ryder, who's missing a front leg.
Okay.
And completely different personalities, even though half of them is still the same breed. Like Annie was very protective, and I don't think it had anything to do with her hips hurting her. Phyllis couldn't jump in. And then Ryder is like the most friendly dog ever, and he's missing his front leg. So,
yeah.
Well, let me show you something fun.
Okay.
Okay, so if we go back to this somatosensory cortex, you see how, let's just focus on the arm,
okay,
and the hand. Let's say you chop off your arm or you lose your arm because of something.
okay.
They've shown that your brain, these neurons will get reused for something else. And so this somatosensory cortex will take away the arm completely. It will and when it doesn't, that's when you have ghost arm syndrome. Have you ever heard of that? Like, yeah.
My husband's was missing.
So like their brain never took away and so it's still thinking that it's receiving signals. But anyways, in a normal person, if you remove the arm, this area of the brain will get replaced by something else because everything in our body has redundancy. And so this is neuroplasticity, the ability to not grow new neurons, but use them for a different purpose is neuroplasticity.
Interesting.
And so it could be, anyways, to answer your question, and my theory would be, and again, I don't know their personalities, but my theory would be that the one who still has their legs is still getting a lot of sensory input in here. Because remember, sensory input can be pain, it can be proprioception, it can be interoception. So they're still getting sort of that chronic activation in here, whereas the dog that doesn't have their leg anymore, they're done away with that part. They don't even need it anymore. So they replaced it with more useful information there.
So it's just like poof, disappeared, sort of.
Yeah, over time. I mean, it doesn't happen immediately, but yeah, over time, that's what your brain does. And so your neurons are constantly, although you can never grow new neurons, you can always grow new pathways. And when I say that, it's the connectivity of the neurons and their ability to send messages to different areas of the body.
Cool. Yeah, because a lot of times I see dogs' behavior excused by, oh, is the dog in pain? Is the dog in this and that? And in my experience, I've seen a lot of dogs in a lot of pain and discomfort because of the shelter and rescue and everything. And most dogs that I see don't act out because of that until they get in a home, and then all kinds of things happen.
Yeah. And you have to think too, like, pain isn't the only factor there, right? So if we come back to here, pain is the interpretive, that's your affect in that moment, but then you're still kind of ignoring these other things. And, I put genetics down here, but it should probably really be more like up here too, because genetics matters. Phyllis knows that. I mean, you both know that. But, pain is like your current state, but that doesn't take into account that dog's history, what it's experienced, and its genetics. And so pain can be an excuse. It certainly doesn't help. But that doesn't mean that the dog is only lashing out because of pain.
Right.
Yeah.
Good explanation. I like that. Because that's kind of what I see.
Yeah.
It depends on the dog, how they're going to react to that.
Totally.
Pain.
And the thing is everyone wants a formula, right? Like, what's the best for? I feel like I probably asked Phyllis this when I first met her, like, what's the best formula for training, behavior? And I feel like she always says it depends on the dog, depends on the situation. That's why, because of these things, you can't have one of these without the other and try to predict an animal's behavior. P.S. We're trying to predict an animal's behavior that is a completely different species than us.
Right.
So
what are some things that you see that drive you nuts about dog training and agility or whatever it might be because of what you know through your job?
I think it drives me nuts when I hear, I'm trying to think about how to word this because there's a right way and okay, so the whole concept of emotion words is it's really important to understand that we use those and they're very functional for us, but they are for us to communicate with each other about how we're feeling in the moment, right? But again, how we're feeling in the moment is just a snapshot of what our body's doing at that moment. So like, again, maybe I'll be hungry in 10 minutes and be like way grumpier, but that doesn't mean that like, I'm a bad person or something, For me to communicate to Phyllis sitting beside me is I'm feeling hungry or angry or fearful. But again, these are all just words that we've used to create a sense of meaning for us to communicate efficiently. There is no biological fingerprint or biological measurement associated with fear, anxiety, depression, anger, happiness, any of those things. I can name any of them. There is a problem in the world of affective emotion neuroscience where we like to try and think about emotions being a special human superpower. They're what makes us better than other species. And emotion is just our interpretation of our interoceptive sensory input at that given moment. And so we create words to explain those. But, a great example of this, I love this so much. I got this from my favorite neuroscientist who I can give you a book that she recommends. She actually has a whole chapter just on dogs, talking about how humans compare to dogs and the idea of like emotions. And it's great. So we have words for emotions, but it's very important to understand that those emotions are not universal. So like fear is not universal. There are some cultures that don't even acknowledge they don't even have the concept of fear. And they have different emotion concepts. They have words that mean a totally different thing. And you can develop those. So long as other people agree that they serve a purpose, that can be a new emotion concept. But if you go across multiple different countries, you will never find a biological signature, like a biochemical signature of fear or emotion. And there are studies, like, have you ever heard of fear learning?
No.
I've heard of that.
You probably have. Like, it was coined many years ago and it got stuck in the scientific literature, but fear learning is essentially, it was coined by a scientist who did these experiments with rats where if they played a tone and then shocked the rat, they would...
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then
the rat eventually learned that the tone meant impending shock, and they would freeze when they heard the tone.
Right.
And the scientist that did... Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. So doesn't that carry over to their young? I've heard that it does. Is that true?
Yeah. Bring that back up.
Okay. Yeah. It becomes a genetic thing, right?
Not genetic, but
no.
It's a nervous system thing.
Yeah.
But he coined the term fear learning. So they learn how to fear fear. Fear is our concept, right? So we're then imposing our human emotion concepts. All they're doing, their brain's just predicting. Well, yeah, when I hear this sound, I'm predicting a shock because that's what's been happening.
Yeah.
But there are lots of studies that have disproved that fear learning concept because they, if you take rats and you put them in a bigger space, they actually don't freeze, they run. And so, it's very, very context dependent. And that word fear, like have you ever heard the amygdala is the fear center in the brain?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's wrong. There are no parts in the brain that is dedicated to an emotion. So like people without an amygdala can still feel fear so long as they have the concept of what fear is. You know, you have to understand what fear means. It's being afraid, it's being cautious, it's being that sort of thing. And so the whole idea that, you know, we have different blobs in our brain dedicated to each emotion is totally false. And it's based on an outdated model of the brain called the triune brain model, which is very outdated, but it kind of stems from the idea that we have this reptilian brain wrapped in this beautiful human cortex, and that's what makes us superior. And that's just, it's incorrect. The only thing that has a reptilian brain is a reptile, right? And that's because that reptile is perfectly adapted for its environmental niche. And so we're not better, we're just different.
Yeah. So is that learned helplessness that you were talking about?
That's also a misnomer.
Oh, please explain.
Please do explain. Thank you, Kristen.
I mean,
here we go.
It just goes back to prediction, right? And again, prediction happens from your past experiences and your affect. So, you know, sometimes being helped, you know, think of an abusive relationship. Sometimes it actually does feel safer to just go with the abuse, right? Like it's hard to leave because you know there's going to be a blow up, you know there's going to be you know, depending on what your situation is, if you're married with kids, like that's super awful, right? So sometimes, but then people just call that learned helplessness, right? It's not learned helplessness. It's your brain taking your past experiences, and it also has been studied that those who tend to be in abusive relationships have had a history of at least witnessing, if not personally experiencing abuse prior. So your past experiences, your current affect, well, if you're in an abusive relationship, your affect is probably chronically pretty low, right? Like really low energy, maybe high arousal if you're really fearful. So, you know, learned helplessness is kind of this misnomer. It's all about survival, and whatever your brain thinks is the best survival tool at that moment, it may be to stay in that abusive relationship, which to the outside world seems so black and white, right? But it's not an easy thing because you have a way out-regulated nervous system at this point. And now you're trying to deal with this incredibly difficult situation.
I think the learned helplessness, the people, Seligman, that did that, they came up with a actual, like, they wrote up something that said, oh, we were wrong about that whole thing. And it's actually just a survival mechanism. And, you know, like this mouse isn't learned to just play dead or freeze because you can't function and whatever. But especially with what I do, I think people like to still
100%
go to that learned helplessness. But from what I've seen, working like Midnight's the dog I have now that I'm working with, she's a great example, is she's quite comfortable with me now. But it's obvious most of these dogs, their default is to submit, like lay down and just be still.
Yeah.
That's their default, but they haven't been beaten or anything like that. In fact, she was picked up as a juvenile, you know, roaming the streets of Las Vegas, New Mexico. I'm guessing that's more of a survival technique to try and feel safe.
Yeah, it's what's going to let me live in this moment right now.
Yeah.
That's always what the brain is going to be doing. And a lot of that is out of your awareness too.
Yeah. And does that, again, I'm human, so I'm going to ask this question.
Yeah.
How do they feel?
I know it's hard, right?
During that moment, because the way I see it is I just have to teach her to do a different behavior eventually.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, okay, let's just get used to me approaching and let me work on giving you, reinforcement when you don't crouch down as much. And then she learns that like me approaching isn't a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. Let's say we're going for a walk and I have a leash in my hand. But what I see happening, I actually just bought a book I haven't read yet, but it took them so long to rehab this dog. Let me just say, like, so long, because they interpreted things like that as like, if I keep doing something to the dog's going to get traumatized and be more afraid of me.
Yeah.
I've been writing a book, and so I'm really curious about how this all works. And I'm like, oh my gosh, maybe more than I think is actually the dog feeling safe.
It's all that.
Yeah.
It's all that for every living species. It's just what's the definition of safe, and what is the individual's historical experience and current physical health, essentially. I can't answer your question of how they feel because we don't know. We can't ever know unless we're them, right? Yeah. So we can make guesses and we can communicate with each other about our thoughts. We think they're fearful. We think this. But ultimately, I think this is maybe a question and the disconnect that I have between what I know and what you guys know, and that I so very much want to bridge that gap in my mind. And it's coming, but I think it just takes time and experience. I can tell you that safety is always going to win. And if you show your dog constantly that you're safe, that this is safe, and again, that could be a very different time for different dogs based on their past experiences. But safety is always the goal. What I don't know is, and what I try to fit in is like, what is a dog going to do when they feel unsafe? Yes, we can talk about the fight, freeze, flee, but all of those are all, let's say they're all equal outcomes that are possibilities. How does the dog choose that outcome? Or how can we predict how that dog is going to react? And I don't have enough experience with dog body language as to give me those insights into how they're going to react, but genetics plays a huge role. We can't ignore that. You cannot ignore what a species' instinctual drive is to do, because that ultimately governs what their actions are going to be as well. And even within humans, we have genetic differences that can impact health. Genes make you who you are, right? Different breeds have different drives, different goals, and it always that really does impact. So that's why I say it's all of these things. But I can tell you the affect part and how historical experiences part, but I don't have enough information about what does a dog do in this situation, and what are the key body language signals that I should be looking for if they're gonna bite, because it can change on a dime, right?
Yeah, and a lot of dogs that I work with initially are very, very, we're going to use the word scared.
Yeah.
A human word.
It's fine, because that's how we communicate.
Yeah. And it's like, people are like, well, how do you know they're not going to bite you? And I'm like, I don't know. I just
feel it.
Yeah.
I just know. Like, because I've had the experience, like you were saying, with enough of them to know the little signs that this one is a little different. You were at the workshop with that one dog I took out, and I was like,
feels different.
Yeah.
But a lot of the feeling that you get, which is what Phyllis is saying, is actually not necessarily from physical cues. They are from it's internal sensory input or excretion of hormones, pheromones that our bodies are picking up from them, that Phyllis knows how to interpret and I don't. It's like that kind of thing. But you
can't
actually
explain it. I just know that
because you feel it, and it's that dog's intent that you feel.
Yeah.
And that's my gap, is learning to understand that sensory feeling that I'm getting from that dog is a no-no. Like, don't go near that dog when you feel like that.
Well, which is also, if we change our internal energy, we can turn that off.
Absolutely.
Which is what I did with that bully that came flying out the door the other day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So basically, when dealing with a dog, any dog, and coming up with a training plan, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
you need to take into consideration genetics, current situation, history, and affect
Mm-hmm.
to really individualize a plan and, let's say, optimize a plan for that dog.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah.
Hey, Julie.
So on the flip side, let's say reactive dogs, because
Mm-hmm.
this is a huge, I don't know how many people have reactivity issues with their dogs. A lot. So safety comes into play, and this is kind of how I see it, and you tell me if I'm on the right track or not, is that the dog feels unsafe a lot of times because it's connected to a person who's not communicating to the dog in the way the dog understands that they are in control of the situation and they're both safe. And so the dog then goes, oh crap, and the dog is on a leash, so it can't escape.
Mm-hmm.
And then the dog's like, oh crap, I got to do something to make this approaching threat go away.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that in a lot of dogs. Of course, then there's dogs that are just aggressive, right?
Yeah. And those are different. And that's where I struggle too, is like telling the difference between, because, like, again, dogs are predators, right? If they think they can kick our ass and they want to, they probably could, like, and they know that at the end of the day. I mean, unless they're like a really small dog or, a really weak human, but a big dog knows they have a chance against you.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to say in a reactive dog, or a purely aggressive dog, I guess, if you change, are they aggressive because they feel unsafe, or are they aggressive because they just don't feel like you should be the leader? Like, and I don't know the answer to the question of, can you modify, like if we use, as an example, because he's kind of one of the only ones that I know, but if you just have that hyper aggressive dog that actually has no interest in sort of, co-regulation with you, interaction with you, can you ever change a dog like that? Probably. Ultimately, if you're a Phyllis and you work with them forever, can you change them? I don't know. These are the questions that I have for you guys. Like, can you change that?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was sitting here listening to the word that we use all the time, which is rehabilitation. And sometimes I see things like, we can rehabilitate your dog's aggression, fear, and anxiety in a 3-week program. And I go, first of all, there's no way that's not going to happen, because it's not enough time for the brain to make changes. But if you do get a dog to what I feel is rehabilitated, right? Once you get it there, if that dog doesn't have what I would consider maintenance balance through the rest of its life, if it were a human, it could fall off the wagon.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you can make behavioral changes in dogs with things, but not things that are genetic.
Exactly.
Like, can we teach a dog never to jump up on the counter again and steal your loaf of bread? Yes.
Can you teach a herding breed to never want to herd sheep? Probably not.
And so I think we can get real deep right there just talking about that.
Yeah, 100%.
Honestly, because,
and the genetics would go back to, okay, does that dog have a sense of self-preservation? Because let's say the dogs that are roaming streets of Las Vegas, it's probably genetic component to them to have that sense of self-preservation, because otherwise there wouldn't be any dogs roaming the streets. They'd all be dead.
Well, that applies to every living thing. That applies to jellyfish. Everything has like a sense of, that's again going back to safety. As long as you're safe, you live. As long as you live, you reproduce and you pass on your genes. So every species has
some kind of a sense of self-preservation. Now, whether they're cognitively aware of it is different, but you can have, like, again, going back to motor reflexes, like the bang on the knee, there are lots of sensory things that your brain is constantly interpreting that you're not even aware that you're doing, like colors and vision and all these crazy things. And you have, like, you're just not even aware it's happening. I'm just looking at you on a camera.
Yeah. Well, and so some breeds, of course, may not have as much of that. I'm taking a certification course, and the instructor, Kim Brophy, goes into this about like dogs we've bred to go into holes after weasels. You know, like, really, that's not a safe thing, or to grab a bull by the nose, right? So somehow, how have we modified those dogs to want to do those things, which could be potentially fatal?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think it's again, I'm going to say it all goes back to safety, but it's really important to keep in mind that safety means different things for different people, right? So safety can mean different things for different dogs. And if we hyperbreed, like, even if we think about herding, a lot of herding dogs get kicked in the face by cattle. Like, it's kind of a dangerous job, if you will. But humans do a lot of dangerous jobs, right? So it's what does that individual think is a safety risk versus a different individual. That can be genetic, but that can also be historical experiences through trauma, through just or just learning like that. So again, it always comes back to safety, but that definition of safety is always changing, even within an individual. It is always changing. And so again, that's the neuroplasticity concept of creating new neural pathways to learn how to learn that something is safe when you used to think it wasn't.
Got it. Because I'm putting my view on that dog of going, that's not a good idea to, get in a bunch of cattle and like run behind them. Right.
Exactly. But like, we also bred them to have that instinctual drive to want to herd things. So they don't view it as a safety risk. We're not asking them to go risk their lives. They want to do it. Like, if you ever see a dog, whatever they were bred to do, whether it's hunting or herding, man, like when you see them get on their thing, it's like, what do you always say? Like, genetics unlocked, right?
Yeah,
it's like,
Yep.
So they aren't perceiving that as a safety risk. And it's all about perception.
Right. And so that might be a good time to talk about rewards then and reinforcement, because then I would imagine those behaviors are extremely rewarding to those dogs. How does that whole, like, give us a layman's rundown?
Yeah, I mean, so maybe I'll explain it in the context of this. Again, it is very individualistic, so it's hard to give like a full a breakdown, right? So if we think about reward processing, we would typically think about that as something that provides high valence, so it makes you feel overall good. But you could have rewards that make you feel high valence but high arousal. Like, you could think of like, I don't know, a roller coaster or something. But maybe somebody hates roller coasters, so they're going to go in like the low valence, high arousal category. But you could have high valence, low arousal, and it still be a positive overall response. But like, you're taking a hot bath, you're reading your favorite book, you're eating your favorite food, those might be kind of those areas there. So again, it's very individualistic, and it can also change at a moment's notice, right? So,
well, can they learn when they're in every state of mind? I would say no, right? There's just not fitting in right
there
here.
Are some states of mind that are just too sympathetically aroused that learning cannot happen. So if you are like at the very top peak here, don't try to teach your dog anything. Just work on calming them down. And so, some concepts that I've heard is like, the idea of simulated play to create a simulated situation of high arousal, and then take the toy away and tell them to sit or something. The theory is that if you keep practicing that in this high arousal state, you get them really revved up. You go play, 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 and then you stop, and then you train them. The theory being that in a high arousal, situation like a dog fight, you could stop your dog. But what that theory does not take into account is the valence. So you could have a situation where high arousal, high valence, like you're playing, you're having a great time, you guys are tugging, and you're both mutually safe and happy. And that will never predict what a dog will do in the context of high arousal, low valence. So like in a fearful or aggressive type of situation, because valence affects, again, it's the combination of arousal and valence that creates affect. And affect is what goes into your prediction. And so you can never artificially simulate a dog fight or like that kind of high arousal environment by a tough toy fight or, some other kind of simulation, because you're not accounting for the valence aspect of it.
So would it be fair to say that the best learning areas are not at super high arousal?
No, I think you can learn in any state, but it's what you learn from that. So, right. So you can learn in a high arousal state. I mean, agility is a great example of high arousal, high valence. And that is like, man, you just learn, you do stuff fast. It's fun. It's you're psyched. But so you can absolutely still learn. Now, yes, you can get to like a max high arousal point where your body just shuts down and it's like too much to actually start learning. But just because you're in a state of high arousal doesn't mean you can't learn. Okay. And vice versa with valence.
Gotcha. I misunderstood you were saying you can't train for things that are almost like you can't even take the dog to that level of arousal.
If they're already in that state of arousal, like if they're already so like off the top of the charts, like
in a predatory state,
like, I don't know, chaos, like don't try to make this like a teaching moment, right? Like start down here and work your way up.
Okay.
But again, remember that valence always impacts your predictions, and valence changes based on context.
Because I hear that a lot with, oh, the dog's so afraid or they're panicked, they can't learn.
No, that's not true. You can always learn. And in fact, sometimes, and this is kind of what trauma response is, when you're in a really high arousal state and low valence state. So think of like a really traumatic event. If you people that have been to war and stuff like that, like PTSD is a very real thing because you actually have sensory information now tied with that memory in your brain. And so a lot of memories we don't actually have, like we can remember them, but they don't induce like an actual sensory feeling in our body, right? But sometimes traumatic memories can, and that's you hold that. So that is a form of learning. That is a learned memory, essentially, where you're holding that physical experience along with that mental experience.
Gotcha. Yeah, and interesting. I'm looking at this whole diagram with the homeostasis, and that's where we're most comfortable. Like
that is your body's goal.
Yeah.
Your body is always, its goal is always to be at homeostasis, which is like, you've got enough glucose levels, you've got enough dopamine, you've got enough serotonin, and this is very fluid. You come out of homeostasis all the time, but this is your body's goal. You don't have the mental goal of like, I should be in homeostasis right now. But, your body's constantly your gut moving around and stuff like that. It's constantly working towards that central goal.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
So is that like meditation gets you there?
Yeah.
Okay.
I know, like, people crap on meditation all the time. I will say, meditation is very hard to learn. It is very, very hard. I have been doing it for years, and I can barely do 5 minutes, to be honest, without my brain. I just have a
It's hard
very
to clear your head like that. Yeah.
But man, talk about like a great parasympathetic nervous system activity. It's fantastic.
I find that in the dog training world, food and treats is used a lot for, reinforcing behavior, which is fine. I mean, it works, right? I use it a lot to teach dogs commands and things. It doesn't matter what kind of rewards a dog receives, to how valuable it is. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah.
Because there's extrinsic rewards, intrinsic rewards. And I know we don't know how dogs feel, but your knowledge on the nervous system and things like that, how do those different kinds of rewards work? Because I'm very motivated by chocolate, but I think like if my safety was at risk, the chocolate wouldn't be as important.
So a reward is a reward, full stop.
Okay.
And the value of that reward is individualized. Again, a dog may, and you see this a lot in agility, because it's all about, agility is very reward centric type of training, because you're shaping behavior. And some dogs don't care about food at all. They'll just like spit it out, or they're like, I don't have time for this. Like, I gotta go do agility, right? And so toys are a better reward. So reward,
maybe the agility in itself is the reward.
For many dogs, it is truly. And that's why, sometimes we can be the reward. Sometimes just having that interaction with us is so rewarding for them, because they're social species. So the whole concept of what reward works best is, again, kind of a misnomer, because you have to take what that dog thinks as rewarding. Now, the reward processing itself is the same regardless of whether whether it's food, a toy, or it's just increasing their dopamine, it's increasing their oxytocin, maybe depending on what kind of stimulus they're having. Because you could have a reward that might induce high arousal, or you might have a reward that might induce low arousal. But it's still a reward that produces an overall positive or pleasant feeling. So again, what that reward is and what that means to the dog is going to be individualized. And then ranking the reward in terms of, like you said, chocolate is not going to do it if your life is in danger. That's the case with all rewards. Like, maybe with the exception of something that is super instinctual, and like just embedded into their genes, like hunting or herding, something like that. I think the reward is relative. I think the safety is always going to win. And the only reason I hesitate is because I could see a dog like risking its safety, again, to go get kicked in the face by a cow. So rewards are very contextual and also very individual. What one dog finds rewarding, another dog may not. Same thing for humans. Some people hate chocolate. I personally agree and I love it. But, again, and how much does that reward motivate you to do something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So tap into whatever the dog finds rewarding.
Exactly. And a lot of that is often, you talk about this all the time, is smell work. And that is so rewarding for dogs and not for humans. And this is one of the dog's superpowers, is that they can create purely olfactory concepts. And so what I mean by that is that they can create, like, I create a concept of Phyllis, because I know what Phyllis looks like and I know what she sounds like. But they create a concept of Phyllis purely through smell. And that's why, have you ever seen those like military people come home from Yeah, from those kind of videos, and their dog like doesn't recognize them at first until they smell them.
You're correct.
Even though it's been years
Mhm.
that they've seen them. So that is a superpower that dogs can do that we can't. So we don't create olfactory concepts unless they have like a dramatically big sensory association
They
for
smell
us.
what we see.
Yes, exactly.
And that's why the dog's olfactory system hasn't been, researched more, because we cannot conceive
We cannot.
concept
No.
of, like, I don't even know if I want to go through my life like smelling everything that much, right? The nose is actually a heat-seeking device on a puppy, a newborn puppy.
Yeah,
and
so
that's how they find the mother.
So their thermoception is intact at birth, and their probably their nociception, so their perception of pain, that's what nociception is, and their interoception is intact at birth. But then
So
their
what about
eyes,
the early neurostimulation stuff that a lot of breeders are doing with puppies now, hot and cold, and is that opening up? They say that it enhances the brain, and it makes that. Right? So does it?
I mean,
Julie, you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
Early neuros.
It's
what do they call it?
They do stuff with puppies, like touch their paws between the pads with a little
Q-tip
and turn the puppy upside down
and then right side up, hot and cold temperature.
I mean, I don't know, because I've not ever seen, I never answer something with 100% yes unless I've seen like scientific basis for it. So I'm not going to say yes.
I'll send it to you.
But it seems very developed off of human concepts. They tell you to do a lot of that because, again, like I said, our humans are birthed so young. They need a lot of help fine-tuning their nervous system.
Well, I think what she's asking is, like, can all that stuff improve their whole socialization? I mean, I think that's where it's going to, right?
Well, if I understood it right, it's supposed to enhance things so that they are faster and smarter. But I need to read about it more.
Yeah, I'm feeling very skeptical.
I mean, I've watched breeders do it, but I don't. I'm wondering if it's all true or not. If it's actually doing something.
Well, right? I think that's exactly the point, right? There's the concept of doing something, and it may very well have a minor impact on your overall current state, but
this is what it says it does. Improves stress tolerance, cardiovascular performance, and immune system strength.
But again, a lot of those things are very human specific, like the Q-tip between the toes. Like that is training your sensory mechanoreceptors.
Okay.
But I don't know. I guess I'm hesitating on that because I go back to every species is perfectly adapted for their environment. And I just don't know that we need to be trying to modify dogs' nervous systems in ways that we don't actually understand what it's really doing.
Well said. I mean, I always just let my foster puppies, but here's the thing, right? If they're outside doing what puppies would do normally, they're going to get all that.
Yeah.
That's right.
So I think the people might be trying to make up for maybe the dog's not being outside due to risk of disease, or maybe it's a breeder that doesn't have enough time, or I don't know, right?
Like a lot of them think it's a form of socializing the dog.
Yeah, I think the problem there is, like, again, I think the intent is well-meaning, but I think, again, we are interpreting all of that through that human lens. Yeah. And so we don't really know what it's actually doing to the dogs. And we don't actually even have a way to measure that because we can never fully understand
what they would have been.
Otherwise, right. Or what they're feeling in the moment.
My daughter always did all that stuff for me because she'd hold them and, handle them a lot. So I'm like, okay, we're doing that. So one thing you mentioned to me was that dogs can perceive play as positive or negative. And of course, we've talked about the differences in breeds and kind of what they may enjoy and what they are drawn to and what they aren't. I guess enjoy is another human
totally
thing, right? I mean,
yeah. I think the concept, the word enjoyment is a human thing, but I think the concept, I'm not saying any of this to say that fear or happiness, that those aren't real. They are very real interoceptive feelings, and dogs have those too. So enjoyment is a very real thing, but to call it enjoyment and to put it in this category of enjoyment, that's where the human perception comes in, and we may be attributing a dog's action. Like a great example is like whale eye, right? Like a lot of people think whale eye is really cute, but like,
you're right.
You know, it actually means
Cocker
something
spaniel look.
really different in the dog world.
Yeah.
But again, because we're interpreting that through the human lens, because humans have more of the whites of their eyes that show, we have neuroception that understands that. We look for that in dogs. We think it's cute. It's not cute. It's actually not a great behavior, right? Like you don't want to see that.
So maybe, well, and there's a difference between maybe enjoyment and then on your chart with the arousal.
Yeah.
Like
Exactly.
arousal isn't always enjoyable.
Very much. And
like over arousal can be, at least to me, can be rather unpleasant.
yeah.
So,
and if you're thinking about that good versus bad play, like going back to sort of that simulating play to try and recreate a high arousal environment, like you can never recreate a situation. And again, every dog is going to interpret that differently. So, you know, maybe I'm trying to think of an example.
So like the people do these dog reactive classes where they have all these dogs in class that are all reactive.
would that be high arousal? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. But so if all those dogs are reactive.
Well, that's probably high arousal, low valence though, right? Because everybody's like really aroused and not feeling great about their environment.
Well, are you recreating, like, for, let's say a lot of those dogs are going to that state of mind because they want to fight with other dogs, or they're defensive with other dogs. Either way, they're reactive to dogs.
Yeah.
Right.
But you also have to appreciate too, then, like you're in a class with a bunch of reactive dogs. Are you going to have the same dog outside of that environment? Because maybe in that environment, they see 10 other bigger, aggressive dogs. And they're like, oh shit, like maybe I should just tone it down this time and like not be too aggressive. And you're like, oh, my dog's doing great in class.
Right, exactly.
But like that, again, is very contextual. You take that dog out of that class, how is that dog going to do when they are actually feeling like they're the ones back in charge?
Well, and the people too. So, you know, that's never just the dog. There's always a human attached.
Very much.
The people may become comfortable in class, which is great practice.
Yes.
To develop skills to then use in more real world environments. But I always tell my clients, I'm like, look, there might be a time when the shit just hits the fan and all you can do is just hang on to your dog and try and get out of there.
Yeah.
Like,
right.
You know, like a loose dog running up, or I don't know, crazy stuff happens in the world.
Yeah.
Like all the training goes out the window and you're just trying to be safe. Really.
Exactly.
Right. So, and I actually try and give them some ideas of what to do if that happens, because in Albuquerque, it happens all the time.
I bet.
I mean, like that time you had 3 coursers coming after you and your dogs, like when you're by yourself and
Yeah.
3 off-leash coursers coming after her when she was walking dogs. I remember that.
Yeah. That's why I moved.
Yes, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I'm like, this is enough of off-leash dogs in this neighborhood. I'm out.
I thought you had 2 people sitting on motorcycles watching what was going on.
We're sitting on a motorcycle and they revved the engine and that's what stopped the dogs.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't know that. Okay.
They didn't get off the motorcycle, but now that I'm thinking about it, they were concerned about their own safety.
Yeah. Of course. Well, of course.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of also gives you like a better perspective, right? Like it takes away the bad versus evil and puts us all sort of on this equal plane of like, what is that species doing to be safe? And then what is that species sort of natural drives or desires?
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, Phyllis and I were talking about this. Was it yesterday that, you know, a lot of people default to freeze?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Very much.
Especially when their dogs start to get really naughty.
Yeah. And it's all tactics too, right? Like they may freeze one time and they may fight the next. Like, again, this whole chart is very, very fluid. So you could be in like a high arousal, high valence play. Let's say I'm just tugging with my dog, having a great time, but then they smell something that I don't even see, and it all of a sudden shifts them into low valence. They have an association with that smell that is very negative or bad or you know, scary. And all of a sudden they've shifted from this high arousal pleasant state to a high arousal low state. And will they turn on you? Will they toss out the toy that you're playing with and go chase down the smell? Like, what the dog is going to do in that situation can change.
For sure, because I have coyotes and wild horses. Of course, the dogs are really aroused when the coyote's walking by the fence.
Yeah.
The first time I went to grab, you know, a dog's collar or whatever, or even get close to them during that time, I'm like, okay, what's going to happen?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, are they so aroused they're going to just like lose control and go after whatever is next to them? Or it's interesting, like looking at things just with this, we should just have this chart in our wallet.
Right.
You go, okay, which quadrant is this in?
Yeah. And then, but then it also helps you understand, when you can understand it in the text, in the context of the quadrants and not just arousal level, when you also account for valence, you can then also think about, all right, what can we do to address this current situation to move us back to homeostasis? Because what you do in a high arousal, low valence situation is probably pretty different than a low arousal, low valence situation, right? So it really depends on where you are at the, or where the dog is in this point in space in that time, for you to figure out what's going to be most beneficial for that dog.
Oh, so if we have a dog that's just naturally like vibrating, you know, like
people like that, you can literally feel the vibration coming off of them,
like anxiety.
Yeah.
I mean, yes.
No, not anxiety, like adrenaline.
Yep. I mean, it's the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, and like the dog's just on edge, right? And hypervigilant and all these things. Maybe if you do something with them that's going to raise their arousal even more, that's not going to bring them back to homeostasis.
Nope. It's just going to increase them. It's just going to elevate. And depending where they are on the valence chart, you know, that can have very different outcomes.
Yeah. And a dog that's maybe been in the shelter, is depressed, right? For lack of a better word, like kind of withdrawn. You get that dog out and you go for a walk, or maybe you do like, you know, some sniffing or whatever. It's going to raise that dog up to the middle of homeostasis.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And sniffing is a great thing to bring down. I mean, I in some context, it can be high arousal as well, but I think, you know, you use sniffing so much with your fearful dogs to actually bring the arousal up a little bit and the valence up a little bit. And that is because of that predominance of olfactory sensory systems with dogs, that can be a very calming thing to it can activate their parasympathetic nervous system. And it's all about like the concepts, right? The more you can create concepts, the more flexibility that your brain has to understand the current situation. So creating multiple olfactory concepts with dogs is very helpful for them, and overall would reduce their level of fear, because they know that they can rely on their olfactory concepts and creating those, and that they can quickly associate that with safety or unsafety because of the neural wiring, which is different than humans.
Okay, so concepts. So I'm trying to think what that would be to a dog to create an olfactory concept. Like, I mean, I know that I identify things by smell, but I think you're talking a little more something else.
Yeah, like a concept is like a whole biological sense. So like I have a concept of Phyllis, or like the dog has a concept of Phyllis. You can't break that down into a single scent that is defining Phyllis. It is the combination of all the scents, and the neurotransmitters that they're picking up and the pheromones, all of those things create Phyllis. There is no other Phyllis. There is no one that can ever be another Phyllis to a dog, because that is their concept. And because it's on a grand scale of all of Phyllis, not just Phyllis's dopamine levels. Sorry to keep talking about you. That's why it's a concept that can't be replaced with something else. It is her own concept because it's her own biochemical makeup.
Would it be possible to create a concept of like feeling calmer or getting more towards homeostasis when they do the act of sniffing, even if it's human directed? Like, for example, dog sees another dog coming, and I'm like, hey, instead of reacting to that dog, let's go sniff this bush over here. Mm-hmm. And the dog's like, okay. And so it's releasing pressure because it's lessening conflict, right? I guess it's creating more safety because there's not that tension of, is that dog going to attack me or whatever? But then the dog's also getting the reward of sniffing. And so, but I can't start at that spot, right? No. I have to train the dog in a more calm, like benign environment.
For sure.
First. So is that creating a concept in the dog's mind? Like when I motion my hand, the dog's like, okay, let's do this. And I'll feel
100%. Yeah, I know. I get what you're asking, and you're absolutely right. But you can't start at the end, right? Because the end holds multiple concepts, which is don't look at the dog over there, sniff this over here, feel like there's all those concepts that go into that. If you just dive into the end and expect a dog not to pay attention to the aggressor over there, you're not going to be successful. But if you slowly build up the concept of we sniff together, and when we do that, we have a pleasant, an overall high valence together, and then you incrementally build up to show, hey, maybe this variable changed in this sniffing session, but look, we're still safe. And then you build up again. And then eventually you get to that point where the dog will understand that your motion or whatever you've attached to that concept will direct them to something that is more pleasant than what they might otherwise do. Does the dog actively think, I'm going to have this high valence, no, they're not thinking that, but it's the same idea, right? And yes, they can learn from that, and you can build to that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And that would work with any reward, like food or even
whatever the dog finds pleasant.
Even avoiding punishment, right?
Yeah.
Like, hey, don't look at that dog, or, I'm going to pop your collar.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Yeah. Oh, you know what question I loved of yours was about measuring serotonin levels.
Okay.
So one of your questions was that you were listening to a podcast about depression in humans. The psychologist on the show mentioned that antidepressants and how they affect people are somewhat a mystery. True. This is due to us not being able to measure serotonin levels in our bodies. False. If we know about it, we can measure it. How else did we discover it? So yes, we can measure serotonin, we can measure dopamine, norepinephrine, all these things. What we don't know is their clinical correlation to these disease concepts. So what level of serotonin in your blood correlates with you feeling depressed? There is no correlation because that is not the mechanistic cause of depression. You cannot take a marker in your system and say that this is the cause of X without clearly demonstrating that. And that has not been demonstrated in the context of depression and anxiety and things like that.
Wow. All the drugs that people are taking. Well, and I had a lot of questions about drugs with dogs. Let's talk about all the behavior medications in people and dogs. I don't care.
It's the same thing.
And it's interesting because typically I don't use behavior meds, very rarely, but Taz had surgery, so she's been on them, right? Mm-hmm. because she has to stay still and calm. And I've now taken her off everything but the carprofen. So, but I was curious, because of course when she's sedated on all these meds, she's like a little more tolerant of being handled and things like that. And I was really curious if that learning is long term after the meds are stopped.
The learning of being
like
more
what you can do. You mean what you can do when they're medicated versus, and then that continuing on that you can still do those things when the dog is unmedicated?
Yeah.
Like, let's say a dog doesn't like its feet handled like that. Is that what you mean?
Well, like with Taz, it's like she was sedated, so she was a little more receptive to being petted and things like that. But yeah, it could be, right? Feet being touched or going to the vet.
Yeah.
The dog, this is what I've seen, is that dogs on trazodone in particular seem to actually get worse
Yes.
over time when they have to do the thing that they're being medicated for.
Correct.
So,
See that all the time. What is that?
Let me start. I'm not going to go through all of this because it's far too much, but this is all of these are different neurotransmitters that we use in your body.
Okay.
I know you've heard of dopamine. I know you've heard of serotonin, but those aren't the only ones. These are all different neurotransmitters, and they are constantly in flux in your body. They're constantly changing based on affect, based on what your body's metabolic needs are at that time. And they affect any kind of nerve cell, whether in the central or peripheral nervous system. One of the things about psychiatric medicine is that because of that divide between psychiatric medicine and medical or body medicine, that divide between the brain and the body, which is an artificial divide that we placed, the psychiatric drug development world works on altering these different neurotransmitters in your body in the assumption that it'll change your mood. But there is a tremendous amount of off-target effects because they affect your whole nervous system. But they don't really think much past that, the doctors or developers, because they're like, oh, what's happening in the brain? And they ignore kind of the peripheral nervous system. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I did take the drugs that you gave me and I made a chart just mostly to help me talk through it. But
I was like, this is a long list.
Yeah, no, I wasn't going to go through all that, but I wanted to show it because it's so complex. And a lot of these drugs are very, very complex. And again, we are trying to make assumptions about, we don't even know how these drugs work in humans. We cannot make assumptions about how they work in dogs.
Cymbalta, isn't it a pain?
Well, it's often used for pain because, again, if we go back up to what does the nervous system do? Proprioception, sense of movement, balance, thermoception, nociception, pain. Nociception is pain. That is the biochemical word for it.
Okay.
So a lot of these drugs do have off-target effects on pain, but pain is a neurological phenomenon. The word pain is a concept. My idea of pain might be very different than yours or someone else's. So it is a very subjective measurement.
Oh, well,
that's a scale of, is your pain 1 to 10? Like,
oh my
is
God.
that?
I mean, it helps doctors to understand where you are in your pain, but you can never create that. My 10 might be your 4, right? Like, there's no way to make that equal across humans or across anyone.
Okay.
Because
my husband's 8 is my 2.
Exactly. Like you cannot make it equal, right? So, have you ever seen like men wear those period cramp simulators and they like die? But like
I've never heard of that.
Oh man, it's like a little electronic like simulation. It just simulates period cramps and they like freak out about it. But like we go through that monthly. So, anyways, there are these different classes of drugs. Most of these are the ones that you gave me.
I added this one at the bottom as an example. But if we start with Prozac or fluoxetine, which is the most commonly prescribed one, at least in the dog world, it's getting a little bit less relevant in the human world because we now know that about 20 to 50% of humans have genetic resistance to SSRIs. I'm one of those. I've had genetic testing, and SSRIs are completely inefficient on me because the receptor that they target, I have a different version of it. So it doesn't even work on me. But yet we still prescribe Prozac.
So how can they prescribe that to a dog not knowing that?
Well,
or,
because
I mean, how would you even know that?
Well, that's the point. They've done studies. You have to do a study to show effects in order for something to be approved. And fluoxetine is FDA approved for the treatment of anxiety in dogs. Mm-hmm. But who's interpreting anxiety?
Why are they putting dogs on fluoxetine for aggression?
Well, yeah, because they're just assuming that it's all just arousal. But also, all of those studies are done through the lens of human emotion concepts. So we are looking at a dog, we are classifying it as an anxious dog. Okay, now that dog is allowed to enroll in our study because it is an anxious dog. And then we are looking at the change in symptoms, and we are perceiving an improvement or not in their anxiety. But we are not taking into account the fact that they're in a lab. Maybe that's stressing them out and calming them down and making them not want to move. We're not taking into account genetics. We're not taking into account to canine thought processes and drives. So it's yes, they've been through clinical trials and they've been shown to be safe, but the effectiveness is very subjective because it's all through a human lens. It's even subjective for humans, right? Because we're trying to measure these things like anxiety and depression, but there are studies that show that millions of people don't actually know how to tell the difference between anxiety and depression. And who's even the right one, right? Who's right to say what anxiety feels like versus depression? So again, it's a concept. So, there are different classes of drugs, and these drugs fall into different classes depending on their key mechanism of action, MOA. And so SSRIs are serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And so at the nerve ending, you have all this serotonin, and because the body is very efficient, it reuses it. So it sort of dissolves back into the nerve, and then it can come back out and just sort of do this cyclical loop. But SSRIs block that reuptake inhibitor receptor. And so you have more serotonin sitting out in between the nerve to theoretically increase nerve conduction. Okay. The idea behind that is not wrong, and it does do that. But when Prozac was marketed as a drug for depression, and it is approved for major depressive disorder, they didn't look at other things like how the highest prevalence of serotonin receptors is in your gut. Like that's why so many psychiatric medicines have a lot of gut side effects like diarrhea or constipation, and they're like really random side effects that seem very opposed. So a lot of psychiatric medicines were only developed with the central nervous system and brain in mind, and forgetting that they have broad effects across the peripheral nervous system as well. So overall, SSRIs, Prozac, SNRIs, SARIs are all similar. They largely target serotonin, whether that's the serotonin receptor, whether that's the serotonin that's just in your body. They all have slightly different mechanisms of action, but the key point is that they focus on increasing serotonin levels. SNRIs focus on the increase of serotonin and norepinephrine. And also norepinephrine and epinephrine are the same as noradrenaline and adrenaline. They're just UK word versus US word. Okay. And then trazodone has specific effects on orthostasis and sedation. And that's because it also affects this particular adrenergic receptor, which I realize that's very sciencey, but if you want to look at it, I'll send you these slides and you can look them all up, because this slide shows what the key role is. So like norepinephrine and epinephrine, and then it shows all the receptors. So keep in mind that norepinephrine is a single molecule, but it can bind every single one of these receptors. And every single one of those receptors produces a different response. So alpha-1 causes vasoconstriction. Alpha-2, reduced neurotransmitter release or reduced sympathetic outflow. So all of the different receptors can induce a different response depending on what it is binding. These two drugs are old. So the SSRI, SNRI, and I mean, that's not a big drug class. These are newer versions of TCAs, essentially. These are very outdated versions. And honestly, I think that's why, I don't know this for sure, but my guess is that's why they're being used in dogs right now, because we do have a lot of data in humans about them. But they have very strong serotonergic activity, but they also have a lot of risks associated with them. And I pulled this off the internet, this figure down here, because drugs are also very dose dependent, and the effects of a drug can change depending on the dose. So here you've got trazodone, exact same drug, but it's marketed for insomnia at lower doses, but at higher doses, it's marketed for as an antidepressant. And that's because at higher doses, it primarily focuses on these particular receptors, which induce a different response overall.
So if a low dose helps you sleep, what does a high dose do? Put you out?
I mean, well, the sedative effects are supposed to be less the higher the dose. It's similar across all drugs. Like another good one is low dose naltrexone. Naltrexone,
I've heard of that.
I don't even remember what its original use is, but at very, very high doses, it might actually be a psychiatric medicine. I'd have to double check, but it's used off label, so not what it was approved for, at very low doses as an anti-inflammatory. But the second that you start upping the dose, it starts having different effects in your body. And that can be just due to overload in the system. Like when you have too much of something, your body changes how it's going to use that thing or discard of it or get rid of it or metabolize it. So your body has a different response depending on the overall load of drug or whatever in your system.
What about like tolerance building?
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge problem.
Okay.
So, and this is actually what happens in drug addiction or alcohol addiction, is that you have chronic exposure to some sort of stimulant or something that changes how you feel. And that will go back if you stop using the drug, right? But if you continuously use the drug, the body's like, well, crap, I've got so much like dopamine in my system. Maybe I should downregulate my dopamine receptors. And so your body actually starts to change its biochemical makeup to adjust for the excess dopamine in your system.
Which is why you need more.
And then you need more. And then you need more, because now you got used to how you felt with that drug on board with all of your dopamine receptors. But then your body's like, this seems really redundant. I'm going to start down regulating the dopamine receptors and get rid of them. And now you're like, oh man, I feel like I'm not having the same effect anymore. So you up your dose again. Now you've got more dopamine in your system. So your body further down regulates those receptors. And it's like this constant back and forth. And eventually it just totally down regulates them. And you can create permanent changes after a very long time.
Wow.
So gabapentin is a commonly used one. This is actually more considered a nerve drug, like a neuropathic pain drug. And it is used kind of off label sometimes in psychiatric indications. But I think where, if drugs are ever going to be useful for dogs, we have to stop thinking about how they're feeling and look at more objective signals of what they're telling us, right? And this is why, like, we need behavior experts, people who have been around dogs, the people who can feel what the dog's intent is without having to do all this analysis. Like, I'm still at the analysis phase, right? Like, what's their tail doing? What's their ears doing? But the people that have been doing it so long, they just know, they feel it. They have that prediction already ingrained into them, those concepts already ingrained into them. It's you have to look at what the drug is doing in the context of a dog and not in the context of, does the dog feel depressed? Because dogs don't feel depression or anxiety. They may get stressed. They may get, again, these are all words that we're using, but they may get high arousal in certain situations. But again, that arousal can be due to many different things. And so using these drugs that don't even really have great efficacy in humans is from my perspective, not a great idea. And I can also say that from the perspective of, I did go to a veterinary behaviorist who put my dog on a lot of drugs, and it made things worse because, again, now you're giving a drug, and it's easy for us to take a drug and say, see how you feel in 6 weeks, right? Come back, let me know. But what are you going to do how are you going to tell the dog that you are doing something that may affect their central nervous system, their heart rate, their blood pressure, all of those little things, which all of these drugs affect, all of those go into your interoceptive sensations and produce affect. So you can't even explain, like, hey, I'm going to give you this drug. You may feel some weird side effects. So their arousal to these side effects is probably even grander than a human's arousal because we know it's coming. So we're already predicting, maybe I'm going to feel a little tired today. Maybe I'm going to feel I'm going to have some GI upset, some stomach upset. You can't even tell that to a dog. So now they're all of a sudden,
I've said that so many times.
all of a sudden they're feeling like, my stomach hurts. Why does it hurt? Why do I feel so tired? I shouldn't be feeling tired right now, And they have no way to understand that and no concept for what's going on. So for, like, in the case of trazodone, you're sedating them. They don't understand why they're feeling so tired and so lethargic.
Is it true that their brain is still at full function, but the body can't follow?
That would be another
Which would
thing.
Make you feel...
Yeah, like if your brain's going a million miles an hour, but you don't have full access to your motor function.
That's what I'm trying to say.
It's terrifying,
Correct.
Right? Like,
well,
especially if you don't even know why it's happening.
Well, it's like when I've taken a muscle relaxer, when I hurt my back, I know I'm taking the muscle relaxer. I've read the container. I'm like, yep, it's going to make me tired. And for me personally, it affects me. Like I can't even do anything. Like I have to go to sleep.
Well, some people are very different. Everybody reacts to drugs very differently. It depends on how you metabolize. It depends on your genetics. So it's all different. And again, we're trying to apply this to a whole new species that we don't even understand very well in the first place. Or, people that aren't behaviorists don't understand very well in the first place.
Here's a good one. Like, so I think we're talking about the same behaviors, but I've had 2 cases that always come to mind, and I've had many. But the 2 that come to mind, both of these dogs, one was a puppy that was under 9 months old for sure. It was closer to 6 months, was on 5 medications in a short period of time. The other dog was on 9 medications. And so when you put them on all these meds, how are they affecting each other?
We barely know that for humans.
And I mean, and how long does it take for one drug to start taking effect that you either increase, decrease, or it's not working before you layer on the next one? And in both these cases, both dogs were euthanized for having significant bites, after they were put on meds.
Well, and the meds can cause disinhibition.
And with both of these dogs, there was 0 behavioral modification instructions that went along with the meds.
Yeah, that's very true. And I had the same experience. I never got any behavioral training at this veterinary behaviorist. I just was told, take these drugs and all your problems will go away. And obviously they didn't. So, it's really important. And
Well, your dog ended up biting also.
Yeah.
After.
And this isn't also to say that drugs don't have a place. I work in drug development. I believe in drugs and I believe in vaccines for the right reasons in the right context. And when we know that they work. And so the reason I put clonidine down here is because it's actually a drug for hypertension, so high blood pressure. It is highly specific. So it only affects the alpha-2 adrenergic receptor. So if we go to alpha-2 right here, when it's activated, because keep in mind, activation, the same receptor can have different effects if it's inhibited versus activated. So alpha-2 reduces neurotransmitter release and sympathetic flow. Let's go back to our sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system. You have something that's highly specific to the sympathetic nervous system. So slowing down that fight or flight feeling might actually have a lot of benefit without the sort of cross central nervous system effects that might be concerning for a dog.
Mm-hmm.
So I think drugs have a place. I think that there is a very big gap in psychiatric medicine in general. And so we're just throwing that gap that we already have in humans onto dogs now. These broad spectrum drugs that hit so many different aspects of the nervous system are probably creating more confusion in dogs than actual help. And I think we should think about, if we're going to use human developed drugs in dogs, they need to be highly specific for what we want. And I think we should explore things that aren't necessarily developed in humans for depression or something like that, or anxiety or OCD or those sorts of things, or rather for hypertension or those sorts of things, like those signals of sympathetic activation.
Mm. Well, when Ryder had his leg amputated, of course, he was also on some sedatives, and he was on trazodone maybe 2 weeks. He was still having balance issues.
Mm.
As soon as I took him off the trazodone, he could walk so much better. And I was like, wow, I wonder, I realized that may not happen to all dogs that are on it, but if he was a different dog and felt that way, it would have really messed him up. He's just so mellow. I don't think it mattered, but
I mean, he's genetically sound. Let's just say it, Julie.
Well, yeah, but
I'm taking a guess because I haven't done the research. But again, if we look at trazodone, antagonizes alpha-1 adrenergic receptors. We go to alpha-1 adrenergic receptors down here. If you activate it, you're going to get vasodilation and orthostasis issues. So orthostasis is your ability to stand. Have you ever heard of POTS?
Yeah.
This is kind of a multi-systemic issue, but the key symptom of POTS is an orthostatic standing intolerance. It could also be coming from a balance issue. So if we go back to this figure, this little portion right here is called the cerebellum, and it's your little brain, and it is responsible for posture and balance. And so perhaps trazodone has more effects in the cerebellum. Again, I don't know, I'd have to look it up, but it would depend on whether the trazodone was affecting their orthostatic tolerance or their balance, which are two very different sensory processes in your brain.
Well, I always just describe dogs on trazodone as being drunk.
Yeah.
Like an alcohol effect, right?
Yeah.
Where they're, I don't know. Right?
Yeah.
Would you agree with that, Julie?
I don't know. I mean,
Maybe it depends on the dose.
There's various dogs in the rescue that we've put on trazodone at the request of the vet because I couldn't go with them. And I will tell you, it made every single dog worse.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's all I know. Like, I don't know why, but that's what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the vets are like, well, now we need to add on more drugs. I mean, that's when I was like, no, let's take her without being on trazodone. And I went with, and I realized not everyone has access to someone to help them take their dog to the vet, or like we go back to the connection between dog and owner. If the owner is worried, the dog's going to malfunction and all kinds of things, but it just irks me that there's no behavior modification given. I mean, most people that go in with psychiatric concerns will be given counseling or therapy or anger management.
And dogs aren't getting that.
Yeah.
If they're getting it, it's not appropriate.
Absolutely. And again, I think these drugs can help get to a place. They should never be like a long-term solution, right? I mean, unless you actually have like a biochemical dysfunction where your body doesn't produce enough serotonin, which does happen. That is a thing. And that's a perfectly valid reason for that. But they can be a good way to get you to where you need to be, but you have to have a transition off plan, right? So you can't stay on clonidine forever. But it can reduce the overall arousal levels when you have just like a super traumatized dog and you just need them to like breathe for a second, right? Because you can't tell your dog to do breathing exercises, but so they can be helpful, but I think there's not enough information that we know in humans, let alone in dogs. And plus, one tiny wiring change can make a huge difference. We don't understand enough about dogs' nervous system and their wiring to be giving them drugs that we don't even fully understand how they work.
Well, so I think it's the sedation that people see that they feel is working because the dog is just, I mean, if you go back and look at the photos of the place that you went to, the dog's third eyelid is showing in the photographs. You got dogs sitting in a car with third eyelids and just drool, pools of drool. And like people think that's okay because they're not reactive, but they're in such a sedated state.
And that's why we need people like you guys to help us, because I look at that, right? As before I met you guys, I'm like, oh, look how calm and nice. They look so happy. That's my perception based on the knowledge that I had prior to the experiences that I've had and meeting you guys and learning more. That was my perception of that picture. But Phyllis looks at that same picture and gets a totally different perception because she has those concepts for what that third island showing means and what the facial expressions mean in that dog. So it's important to take both sides and bring them together.
Yeah, and the studies that I found about these drugs, and they'll claim they're effective, but then you have to read the fine print.
Oh, yeah.
You have to read the whole thing. And for example, they took a bunch of beagles and transported them in a crate in a car. And they counted probably how many times they lip licked and panted and all that. And they were like, yep, this drug works on anxiety.
Yeah.
Well,
again, anxiety being an interpretation of what they're feeling.
And I'm like, well, but it sedated the dog doing the behaviors.
Yeah.
We don't know what that dog is still thinking. And it will improve their experience in the car next time.
Exactly.
And like, those are the things for me that I'm not seeing that. It would be, believe me, if there was a drug that I could give these dogs and they'd be normal pets, I'd use it.
Yeah.
But it's not what I see happening is that, maybe with the right dose and the right drug, like you could calm the dog down enough that it could actually learn better, I guess, or be more towards home. I don't even know how that would work. That's one of my questions, right? Like, does the dog need to be sedated to learn to be?
I think the opposite. It can't learn as well, right? Or am I right?
Well, I think it can be anything. A dog can be so drugged that they're at such a, if we go back to I love always
these are great.
If they get to such a low arousal state that they don't even want to get up, or they're modifying what they would normally do otherwise, that's an artificial representation, right? And that dog is never going to learn what you think it's learning or what you're wanting it to learn. The same thing for the high arousal. If you just get to a point, they're going to shut down or just ignore whatever. But that doesn't mean a dog can't learn in a state of low arousal or high arousal. But if they're hyper focused on like, God, why do I feel so weird? You can't learn because you're so focused on that.
And it's the same thing with humans. Like, we all learn in that same way. Learning has to be in a way that it clicks, right? If it doesn't click, you're not going to remember it. You're not going to think about it again. You're not going to learn it. But it's got to have some sort of interoceptive connection for you to remember it.
Yeah, like I couldn't learn if I take Benadryl. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah, no way.
Yeah, it affects me so bad. I'd be like, I just wouldn't be like in a state of mind to actually concentrate on anything. So yeah, I think it's interesting, and luckily here, it is not as common to see dogs on, well, the huge amounts of drugs that like Phyllis's clients' dogs are. Or I have a friend in Brooklyn that I did some admin work for, and there were a lot of drug use in the dogs there. And I'd say 80% of the time the clients said they didn't see any difference in the behavior anyway.
Yeah. Acupuncture is another great one for calming the nervous system.
Yeah. So
I've read there's scientific evidence that it works. What do you think? Yeah.
There is evidence that it works, but we don't really understand why. We don't understand how, but it is having an impact on sympathetic arousal and just bringing that overall down. But that could be due to reducing inflammatory markers, reducing just overall sympathetic activate. Like, there's a lot of things that go into creating that state of high arousal. So that's why they don't really know how it works, but it's very clear that it has some effect on the ability to calm the nervous system.
Interesting. I mean, basically the overall message is we don't know as much as we think we do.
That is the underlying message of science in general. And you can never know. We never know everything because we're always learning new things. We're always making new discoveries, and we have to stay current with new discoveries. And we also have to be willing to accept new discoveries. A big problem in science is, a theory is taken in science until it's disproved, right? Like, you show something and you demonstrate it and it becomes your scientific theory, but scientific theories are constantly being replaced, right? And so, but if you develop that scientific theory and you made a great scientific discovery, sometimes you get really attached to those, and you don't want to understand that was just one puzzle one piece to a really big puzzle. But it's your responsibility as a scientist to be able to try your best to look objectively at all data and not just the data that fits your conceptual knowledge system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's hard to do.
It's hard, very hard. Yeah, it's our innate wiring. That's just what we do. But it's always good to try and take a step back and sort of think about it holistically.
It would be a great course for dog trainers. Just this arousal valence thing. And the visual helps me go, okay, want to get back to homeostasis. And then like there's a lot of ways you could use that diagram to kind of make sense of some things, especially when you get difficult cases and you're like, wow, what's going on here? Like this, totally. And then of course you have the people who are often in high arousal.
Well, yeah, and that's
for people.
Is there? I meant to ask you: is there a scientific knowledge or proof about like we can affect each other's nervous systems like that? I was saying, but I was wondering what.
Oh, it's very much proven. Like it's measurable now. So we now have these tools called fMRI. So I'm sure you're familiar with MRIs. But there's a more subtle tool called fMRI, which is functional MRI. And it can peer into the brain and look at the functional activity. And so it maps electrical activity on your brain. And so it can show, like, there are studies that show that the changes in the fMRI readings if someone you like walks into the room, if someone you don't like walks into the room, if you look at a picture that is full of blood and gore versus a picture that is full of flowers, you know?
Unicorns and rainbows.
Yeah, whatever you find particularly appealing. And the interesting thing about humans is that we have a very wide, what's called an affective niche. So anything that can impact your affect is in your affective niche. And so, you know, we could look at a mountain in the distance and be like, oh man, that's so beautiful. Like when we were sitting up at the New Mexico house we were at, I mean, you just get this sense of like beauty, right? Mm-hmm. That mountain is impacting your affect and your body budget, right? That's like pretty wild. It's just like a visual thing. Humans have a very big affective niche. So there's a lot of things that are constantly coming in and out of our affective niche that are influencing our state of arousal and valence. Dogs, on the other hand, have a smaller affective niche, with the exception of their olfactory concepts. Their olfactory niche is significantly larger than humans. But in general, otherwise, they have a little bit smaller of an affective niche, and that's because they have less neural wiring in the interoceptive network.
Like less neural wiring. I got it. Like that part.
Yeah. But your question about the so there's my favorite neuroscientist that I mean, she's the one that I drew this based on her book. So this is all her, but her name is Lisa Feldman Barrett. And she has a book called How Emotions Are Made. And that's the book I was telling you about that has that chapter about dogs specifically. I've read that book or listened to it 4 times. I mean, I cannot tell you the wealth of knowledge in there, but also she has a fabulous ability to explain really complex ideas and distill them down very well for people who are non-scientists.
Right.
So I always recommend that book to anyone that's interested in this. And she will go into much better detail about this sort of like high arousal, low valence.
Lots of things too with that, you know, because when I was young, I would have thought energy, you can't feel energy. It's not a thing, right? Like that's dumb.
Yep.
But of course, now that I work with dogs, but I also work with a lot of people because I adopt dogs to them. And I'm a big believer in it now.
Yep.
The sense I get from people when I meet them, you know, just the overall feeling, it can be so different. And
100%.
And granted, like maybe I don't like their clothes or, I mean.
But all that is goes into your concepts, right? Like maybe you have a concept for shorts that you just find particularly offensive. Like I'm just throwing that random out there. But, you know, you see that and you're like, oh, I kind of already don't like this person. But you're actually more offended by the shorts than like the person themselves or something, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
You have to be aware of that. Like my preconceived prejudices against leopard print, right?
Exactly.
Like,
I hate leopard print.
Yeah. But it gives you as soon as you see someone in leopard print, you have an impression of them, right? So like you do have to be very aware of these sort of preconceived notions that are your built-in concepts. And your built-in concepts are also highly wired by your culture. A great example is in Russia, their rainbows have one more color than ours does. Not because their rainbows are any different, but because their concepts of color are different. So a rainbow is just a continuous visual spectrum of light, and we categorize into red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, so that our brains can make sense of that visual light. They break up blue into light blue and dark blue, and they consider those totally different colors, like red and yellow, like fully different. And so when you start thinking about it like that, and so much is just a concept of, and concepts change so much depending on your background or your culture and all of those sorts of things, it's kind of mind-blowing sometimes to think about like how we all might be interpreting something so differently just because we were raised differently, you know?
Yeah. You have to be very aware of it. And of course, moving to New Mexico, it's a very different culture. And it took me a while to adjust to it. And, but over time too, I think just probably getting older, right? I get less judgmental and I really try to like hone in on who that person is at their core instead of if they're wearing tattoos or leopard print or, whatever kind of superficial things. But I think like being open to the energy thing helps because you don't have to see the person.
A lot of the times, people that have been through really traumatic things actually lose touch with their ability to sense that, right? Because you get so used to being in a dangerous environment or something scary or unsafe that you actually can lose the ability to sensorily detect that about someone. And you get false, like your brain's like, oh, I'm sure it's fine. Like, and you ignore those gut feelings, but those gut feelings are legitimate sensory input that your body's being like, hey, I don't like something.
Well, we could talk about that a whole nother podcast. Dog trainers are really into this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because we're basically dealing with nervous systems in a fur coat, right?
Exactly.
But, maybe that's the name of the episode.
I love that. That's
There you
great.
go.
It was great. Thank you, Kristen,
Yeah, of course.
for sharing all of this and making these slides. It was fantastic.
So much, Julie. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you guys about all this.
No, thank you. It was really, really interesting. And I learned a lot. Thank you so much, Kristen, for joining me for this podcast and for making the slides and going to the effort to help the audience understand the concepts. I would suggest to everyone, if your head is spinning a little bit from all the information you just heard, to take a day or two off and then listen to the podcast again. Personally, I got even more out of it the second time around. Thank you so much for joining me, Julie Hart, for this podcast. I hope you found it inspirational and educational and might cause you to look a little deeper into that canine companion sitting next to you today. Find out more about my online and in-person dog training options. Please go to my website, hearttoheartcanine.com, and go to store to see my workshops. And for online learning, click on the online learning tab. I have tons of online learning about no-centric methods, fearful dogs, feral dogs, and reactivity. Please keep in mind, this podcast is not made for individual dog training information. We do not know your dog. We do not know you. And so this podcast is made merely for entertainment and educational purposes. Please contact a professional trainer or one of my guests or me if you have a dog training concern. Dogs can be inherently dangerous, and it's good to exercise common sense and caution when dealing with dogs. If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit like or subscribe or follow to be notified of our next episode. Your continued support is very much appreciated. I really treasure all the good feedback and personal messages I've gotten about my guests on this podcast. Hope you all have a great day.